All right, everybody. Welcome to Theory Thursday. After I don't know, maybe it's been about a month and a half, maybe 2 months since we actually did an actual theory. Today we are reading something that's from Bataille. Frenchy. Uh, if you are familiar with continental philosophy, you've probably heard of it. If not, heard of him. If not, chances are you haven't. The only thing I know him for, like originally, the way I found out about him is because he wrote some pretty dirty novels, and I want to read them because people
Yes.
say they're
Yeah,
like Desaad, and I don't know if they're worse or
modern
equal,
Desaad.
but they sound pretty damn disturbing.
They're pretty lewd, yeah.
Hmm.
It's not for the lewd. I just want to know. It's you never know. It's an art piece.
It's
That's
yeah,
it's
it's
people
lewd, but it's
literally
quality. It's
critique.
not
Yeah.
just it's not like those what are they called? 50
It's
Shades of Grey or
smut,
anything like
but
It's
that.
it's smut,
well,
but it's spiritual smut. You can learn from it.
well, with Bataille, his whole thing is exploration. Like when he's writing about smudge, he's doing it to explore the limits of human behavior. Like just writing stuff, like just showcasing how fucked up humans can be, basically. That's kind of the too long didn't read version of him, but yeah.
Yeah, according to this guy, who is it? It's a book called The Tyranny of. Is it Tyranny of Ideology? No. The Ideology of Tyranny, I think that's what it's called by some American Italian. The guy has one of those
Oh yeah,
typical Italian names like Pigliucci or something. No, it's not Pigliucci, but it's something like that.
it's Guido Giacomo Barbarado.
Yeah. And he basically says, "Look, man, leftism is evil, and you know who we gotta blame? Bataille,
Ah.
Bataille, and demonology." Literally. So I saw that years ago. I forget where I saw it, but I'm like, that sounds like an interesting book. And then I read, it's like, oh, this guy sounds pretty anti-leftist. Like, yeah, he's pretty anti-leftist. I still want to read it because it sounds interesting. But yeah, he's one of those guys. Typical kind of strikes me as a kind of alt right. It's kind of like leaning towards like those people except like more intellectual instead of the cultural Marxists. No, it's now the Batailleist, like degenerate demonologists,
The French.
occultists. It's the French Legion. It's like they come out of the shadows. He's like, "Oh, you expected us with our baguettes, but you did not expect our baguettes in your ass."
Oh.
God,
I can't make the typical stereotypical French accent. I don't even know. I don't even think I've ever heard of like a French person that makes that stupid accent.
It's
Sacre bleu.
that's
Apparently, they don't go around saying Sacre
I
bleu.
mean, like
They
all
just
I mean,
Europeans honestly sound the same to me. Like the Germans speaking English sound the same as French speaking English. Like I can't tell. But let's get on with this. So,
yeah.
Bataille, Hegel, Death and Sacrifice. The animal dies, but the death of the animal is the becoming of consciousness. I suppose that's a quote by Hegel. 1. Death. Man's negativity. In the lectures of 1805 and 6, at the moment of his thought's full maturity, during the period when he was writing the Phenomenology Spirit, Hegel expressed in these terms the black character of humanity. Man is that night, that empty nothingness, which contains everything in its undivided simplicity, the wealth of an infinite number of representations, of images, not one of which comes precisely to mind, or which, moreover, are not there in so far as they are really present. It is the night, the interiority, or the intimacy of nature which exists here, the pure personal ego. In phantasmagorial representations, it is night on all sides. Here suddenly surges a blood-splattered head. There, another white apparition. And they disappear just as abruptly. That is the night that one perceives if one looks a man in the eyes. Then one is delving into a night which becomes terrible. It is the night of the world which then presents itself to us. Famous quote, if you've ever listened to Zizek, I think this is one of Zizek's favorite quotes, and he reads Hegel according to this. This is not from the Phenomenology of Spirit. This is from, I don't know if this is from one of his lectures in Jena or this is from the Jena phenomenon. There's something called the Jena Phenomenology, I think.
Yeah, this is from lectures, I think.
So it's something he never published, but this was when he was still it sounds pretty mystical, and he changes his tunes, and Zizek says, he doesn't agree with his changing his tune on this. It became a bit too positive, I suppose. Of course, this beautiful text, where Hegel's romanticism finds expression, is not to be understood loosely. If Hegel was romantic, it was perhaps in a fundamental manner. He was at any rate a romantic at the beginning, in his youth, when he was a commonplace revolutionary. But he did not see in romanticism the method by which a proud spirit deems itself capable of subordinating the real world to the arbitrariness of its own dreams. Alexander Kojève, in citing them, says of these lines that they express the central and final idea of Hegelian philosophy, which is the idea that the foundation and the source of human objective reality and empirical existence are the nothingness which manifests itself as negative or creative action, free and self-conscious. I agree. I mean, they don't call Hegel the philosopher of negativity for nothing.
Yeah.
And here, negativity is not about being a negative person
He's too
or whatever.
negative.
Yeah, no. Negativity is just it's really abstract. I mean, literally, the only way I can kind of get it through is either if you're a mathematical person, think about it a negative number times a negative number. That's all it is. From a negative, you can get the positive, but a positive you can't get a negative. So, which is the more fundamental, which is more capable, the negative. Multiply a negative by a positive, you can get a negative. You multiply a negative by a negative, you get a positive. You get something new. And multiply a positive by a positive, you don't get something new. So strange. It's kind of weird how our math works that way. But it works for the concept of negativity. It's also the same as just simply negation. Think of negativity as just something that's negating. So continuing. To permit access to Hegel's disconcerting world, I have felt obliged to mark, by careful examination, both its violent contrasts and its ultimate unity. For Kojève, the dialectical or anthropological philosophy of Hegel is, in the final analysis, a philosophy of death, or, which is the same thing, of atheism. But if man is death living a human life, man's negativity given in death by virtue of the fact that man's death is essentially voluntary, resulting from risks assumed without necessity, without biological reasons, is nevertheless the principle of action. Indeed, for Hegel, action is negativity, and negativity is action. On the one hand, the man who negates nature by introducing into it, like a flip side, the anomaly of a pure personal ego, is present within the nature's heart, like a night within light, like an intimacy within the exteriority of those things which are in themselves, like a phantasmagoria in which nothing takes shape but to evanesce. Nothing appears but to disappear, where nothing exists, except absorbed without respite in the annihilation of time, from which it draws the beauty of a dream. But there is a complementary aspect. This negation of nature is not merely given in consciousness, where that which exists in itself appears, but only to disappear. This negation is exteriorized, and in being exteriorized, really within itself changes the reality of nature. Man works and fights. He transforms the given. He transforms nature, and in destroying it, he creates a world which was not. On the one hand, there is poetry, the destruction that has surged up and diluted itself, a blood-splattered head. On the other hand, there is action, work, struggle. On the one hand, pure nothingness, where man differs from nothingness only for a certain time. On the other, a historical world, where man's negativity, that nothingness that gnaws him from within, creates the whole of concrete reality, at once object and subject, real world changed or unchanged, man who thinks and changes the world. So, when he says that Hegel's philosophy is a philosophy of death, well, it's death because of negativity, And you can. Hegel does this, and so, Kojev is aware of it too, and therefore Bataille must be aware of it. That, death here can be taken both as a static as well as a dynamic. So, there's the process of death as an active, which is the dying. There's the process of death as static, which is just pure death, which is absolute divisions. So, you can say, well, consciousness is the death of nature, in that consciousness, literally is a new realm which negates nature, in which nature cannot really penetrate as such. One of the things that comes from Hegel's dialectic of consciousness in the Phenomenology of Spirit is that he says consciousness is this absolute negativity in which nothing enters which is not by the will of consciousness. A man and a woman, any being that is mental can be in complete denial of the world and anything in it, and you can do anything to them you like. If their will is strong enough, there is nothing in the world you can ever do to literally get inside their head. You can get inside their skull and puncture their brain, but you can't get inside their consciousness and go and make them believe or will something. So, that's one of the deaths, I suppose. The death of action, action kills the objects which it acts upon, it changes them, it annihilates them, negates them. There's another beautiful example from Hegel, which I think is from The Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate, where he gives the example that Adam killed the animals when he named them, because by naming the animals, by giving them this static identity, you kill their identity as life, as living beings.
Yeah.
So naming is a way of killing. This goes with anything, naming, categorizing, anything that you suddenly makes something dynamic static is a form of death, a form of killing.
That's why a lot of people hate being categorized and thrown in under an umbrella.
And the thing about the night is that, well, consciousness, at least consciousness initially, is this void of desire for Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And all it does is consume, negate, negate. And within it, there's nothing but this power to negate, this endless desire. It just keeps consuming, and yet that consumption goes nowhere. The void just keeps filling, but there is no filling in that void.
Yeah.
So consciousness is a sort of thing like that. All of nature literally can fall within our consciousness, and it's kind of what imagination does. Literally anything and everything in nature can be contained within consciousness, and yet at the same time it doesn't fill it completely. It's this night, it's this empty void. The anomaly of a pure personal ego is present within that nature's heart, like a night within light, like an intimacy within the exteriority of those things which are in themselves, like a phantasmagoria in which nothing takes shape but to evanesce, nothing appears but to disappear, where nothing exists except absorbed without respite in the annihilation of time. So everything just constantly being negated. And so, you can indeed speak. There's a book, I forget who it wrote. I think it's probably titled something like Hegel and absolute negativity, and they claim that the actual fundamental concept of all of Hegel's philosophy, including logic, is actually absolute negativity. And, it's not the concept or anything, which, I don't think is wrong, but it's kind of like it's kind of obvious, and so why say it? It doesn't really help to. It doesn't help to suddenly make that a concept and go like, see, that's where it is. Eh. So, man comes from nothingness, consciousness arises from God knows where, returns back to nothingness, consciousness is a nothingness, and therefore, you tally it all up and you have a whole bunch of nothing. Seems depressing, totally not. I think it's pretty great. And if you don't think so, you can fight my uncle, who works at Nintendo. Continue.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, you have anything to say?
Not anything important, really.
Okay, you be the judge of your own thoughts.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the whole point. It's my thoughts are lost to the nothingness now.
Hegel's philosophy is a philosophy of death, or of atheism. The essential and the original characteristic of Hegelian philosophy is to describe the totality of what is, and consequently at the same time that it accounts for everything which appears before our eyes, to give an integrated account of the thought and language which expresses and reveal that appearance. So far, so good. In my opinion, says Hegel, everything depends on one's expressing and understanding truth not only as substance but also as subject. That wonderful line which most people do not understand. I'm actually writing something on that. You'll see it probably next month. In other words, natural knowledge is incomplete. It does not and cannot envisage any but abstract entities, isolated from a whole, from an indissoluble totality, which alone is concrete. Knowledge must, at the same time, be anthropological. In addition to the ontological basis of natural reality, Kojève writes, knowledge must find those of human reality, which alone is capable of being revealed through discourse. Of course, anthropology does not envisage man, as do the modern sciences, but as a movement impossible to isolate from the heart of totality. In a sense, it is actually a theology, where man has taken the place of God. So, a common understanding, what we normally think of knowledge, is not actually knowledge. It's incomplete. We're all aware that it's incomplete, but people aren't aware just how incomplete and in what way it is actually incomplete. Because most people are like, well, we don't know everything, and what they by that they mean is like, well, we just don't know the entirety of like the universal facts or whatever. It's just like somehow the universe is this giant pile of like facts, and God went like, here, there you go. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the form of knowledge rather than like the amount of knowledge. So the form of knowledge is incomplete in that, regular knowledge is not absolute knowledge. It's not knowledge that knows itself. It's not the knowing of knowing which knows knowledge. Or rather, the knowing whose knowing is knowledge. Because if you know the knowing, well, that's a piece of knowledge. And there you go. Ah. So there you go. That's the funny identities in Hegelianism. And of course, knowledge must be anthropological. It's living beings who know. Anthropological for us because we're humans. There can be other beings. If conspiracy theorists are to be believed, there are lizard people out there. So it's not purely anthropology. I don't know what you would call their apology, but whatever. Given the hypothetical possibility, let's keep into account. The truth is out there. So as knowledge being anthropological, it has to find, has to be embodied and revealed through discourse, which is, Hegel says, language is the existence of spirit, the existence of mind, the existence of knowledge, and knowing. Continuing, but for Hegel, the human reality which he places at the heart and center of the totality is very different from that of Greek philosophy. His anthropology is that of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which emphasizes man's liberty, historicity, and individuality. Like Judeo-Christian man, the Hegelian man is a spiritual, that is, dialectical, being. Yet, for the Judeo-Christian world, spirituality is fully realized and manifest only in the hereafter, and spirit, properly speaking, truly objectively real spirit, is God, an infinite and eternal being. According to Hegel, the spiritual or dialectical being is necessarily temporal and finite. This means that death alone assures the existence of a spiritual or dialectical being, in the Hegelian sense. If the animal which constitutes man's natural being did not die, and what is more, if death did not dwell in him as the source of his anguish, and all the more so in that he seeks it out, desires it, and sometimes freely chooses it, there would be no man or liberty, no history or individual. In other words, if he rebels in what nonetheless frightens him, if he is the being identical with himself who risks identical being itself, then man is truly a man. He separates himself from the animal. Henceforth, he is no longer like a stone, an immutable given. He bears within him negativity, and the violence of negativity casts him into the incessant movement of history, which changes him and which alone realizes the totality of concrete real knowledge through time. Only history has the power to finish what is, to finish it in the passage of time, and so the idea of an eternal and immutable God is, in this perspective, merely a provisional end which survives while awaiting something better. Only completed history and the spirit of the sage of Hegel, in whom history revealed in full the development of being and the totality of its becoming, occupy a sovereign position which God only provisionally occupies as a regent. So, by the way, if you haven't read Kojev's lectures on the phenomenology, goddamn, they're great. His style is just in my opinion, fantastic. It's beautiful. I love the way he says things. And they're pretty good. I mean, actually, after reading, I've read 2 of the major sections of the lectures, are in English at least, and I thought they were spot on. There's stuff that he deduced from all that somehow that doesn't make sense to me, but that's just kind of the way interpretation goes. So definitely read those. As for this, God as history as its totality, spirit as its totality. Yes, spot on. In order for Hegel, infinite things are infinite in that they are unbounded, and because they are unbounded, they have no boundary. But in order for things to exist, they have to have a boundary. So the infinite form itself cannot and does not exist. The only things that exist are the infinite form in finite forms, which are part of its infinity. So, you have spirit, you have, this absolute mind. Well, how is it going to exist? It can't exist if it's unbounded, because then there's no differentiation. And so, you go through this whole process of negation, contracts, becomes finite. But in being finite, it has inflicted death upon itself, negativity, and this death can be considered both a temporal death, it can be considered an ontological death. And by ontological death, I just mean categorical boundary. You reach the boundary of an object, and that boundary beyond which it no longer exists. Well, that's its death. And I'm waving my hands around. I don't know why. I don't have a camera on, so it's like I'm lecturing or something. Hello, am I still here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're here.
So there's that. What he says about history never being capable of consummation, it never really closes. I don't think that's really what Hegel's going for. Hegel does seem to have a concept in which history does have a closure, and the closure is the form of the so-called the state of right, the final state, the perfect state, which merely is a state which lives up to the logical conditions of itself. It develops it has its full self-determination and of freedom within itself, or at least as much within itself as it can, because he does admit to the possibility of more states, which are also free and which are also just assholes to each other, and they may have war for whatever reason, but that's how it goes. But that still would be an end of history, even if you have a bunch of states at the end of history. They're each a form of the perfect state, and logically they are quote unquote complete. So that wouldn't be so much.
Yeah.
So that's a different reading of Hegel. So history can be completed. Whether that would make paradise, apparently not. But we're holding out for communism.
Yeah.
Holding up that hope. And yeah, only history has the power to finish what is, to finish it in the passage of time, and so the idea of an eternal and immutable God is in this perspective merely a provisional end, which survives while awaiting something better. Okay, yeah. He might be referring here to the stuff at the end of Absolute, in the last chapter, the Phenomenology of Absolute Knowing, where Hegel says some really cryptic things, such as that spirit is time and history itself. And I wouldn't know what to tell you about that, because I haven't read the full Phenomenology Spirit, so I have no idea. I've read some stuff on it. It's not quite clear to me, so... Continuing. The tragic-comic aspect of man's divinity. This way of seeing things can with justice be considered comic. Besides, Hegel never expressed it explicitly. The texts where it is implicitly affirmed are ambiguous, and their extreme difficulty ultimately kept them from full consideration. Kojève himself is circumspect. He does not dwell on them and avoids drawing precise conclusions. In order to express appropriately the situation Hegel got himself into, no doubt involuntarily, one would need the tone, or at least in a restrained form, the horror of tragedy. But things would quickly take on a comic appearance. Be that as it may, to pass through death is so absent from the divine figure that a myth situated in the tradition associated death, and the agony of death, with the eternal and unique God of the Judeo-Christian sphere. The death of Jesus partakes of comedy to the extent that one cannot unarbitrarily introduce the forgetting of his eternal divinity, which is his, into the consciousness of an omnipotent and infinite God. Before Hegel's absolute knowledge, the Christian myth was already based precisely on the fact that nothing divine is possible, in the pre-Christian sense of sacred, which is finite. Anyone have an idea what that pre-Christian sense of sacred is? Nope. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, the pagan version of sacred is. I don't know. Probably had some.
Probably had something to do with Saturn.
Ah,
But the vague consciousness in which the Christian myth of the death of God took form differed nonetheless from that of Hegel. In order to misrepresent a figure of God that limited the infinite as a totality, it was possible to add on, in contradiction with its basis, a movement toward the finite. Hegel was able, and it was necessary for him, to add up the sum, the totality of the movements which were produced in history. But humor, it seems, is incompatible with work, and its necessary assiduity. I shall return to this subject. I have merely, for the moment, shuffled cards. It is difficult to pass from a humanity humiliated by divine grandeur to that of the apotheosized and sovereign sage, his pride swollen with human vanity. He's talking about the philosophical sage, according to Kojev. Kojev says that Hegel's absolute knowing, the person who achieves that absolute knowing becomes a sage, so to speak. Kind of like a philosophical holy man, whom
beautiful.
nobody cares about, because it's not like, like the mystical holy man, which people are like, oh my god, they're God and they have
So
magical
fun.
powers or anything. No, the philosophical holy man is just like, yep, I know everything. What would you like to know, child?
Well, it's still a very beautiful concept, so.
Oh yeah, like Kojev's essay on that is really great. The Hegelian sage, the philosopher sage. Why, it was so good that I should read it again, because I forgot it. I forgot most of it. I remember it vaguely. I read it on my phone, like going to Yosemite when I went like 2 months ago. Good read, let me tell you. Continuing, a fundamental text. In what I have written up to this point, only one necessity emerges in precise fashion. There can be authentic wisdom, absolute wisdom, or in general anything approaching it, only if the sage raises himself, if I can put it this way, to the height of death at whatever anguish to him. Um, yeah, yeah. In the Phenomenology, Hegel mentions the highway of despair, which is the Phenomenology. It's constantly dying. You get to a chapter and you're like, here is a conception that's going to be the truth, and at first you read it, you're like, that makes perfect sense, and Hegel's like, well, here's a dialectic, and you're like, well, damn, there goes my hopes. I mean, it doesn't happen except for when you get to the chapters which happen to be about your worldview, and then it hurts. Continuing, a passage from the preface of Phenomenology of Spirit forcefully expresses the necessity of such an attitude. There is no doubt from the start of the capital importance of this admirable text, not only for an understanding of Hegel, but in all regards. Death, writes Hegel, if we wish to name that unreality, is the most terrible thing there is, and to uphold the work of death is a task which demands the greatest strength. Impotent beauty hates this awareness, because understanding makes this demand of beauty a requirement which beauty cannot fulfill. Now, the life of spirit is not that life which is frightened of death. spares itself destruction, but that life which assumes death and lives with it. Spirit attains its truth only by finding itself in absolute dismemberment. It is not that prodigious power by being the positive that turns away from the negative, as when we say of something, this is nothing, or this is false, and having thus disposed of it, pass from there to something else. No. Spirit is that power only to the degree in which it contemplates the negative face to face and dwells with it. This prolonged sojourn is the magical force which transposes the negative into given being. I like Miller's translation of that in English better. He says it slightly differently, where he says like beauty hates the understanding because it demands of her what it knows she cannot do. Meaning that the understanding demands a rational explanation, but beauty is just an intuition. It can't provide it. In its intuition, it can't engage the negative. It can't move as beauty. Which is a problem of, just kind of all intuitive forms of knowledge, I think. You get somebody like Whitehead, and Whitehead says, we'll start with experience. Well, how are you going to do that? How does the concept of experience as experience get moving? If you're talking about the concept, yeah, you can get it to move. But if you're talking about actual experience, you kind of get this mystical flow of just disconnected things, or you get the mystical, oneness, which just destroys all determinacy. So either way, you either get disconnected motion or you get no motion. Both are unintelligible. Continuing. The human negation of nature and of the natural being of man. In principle, I ought to have started the passage just cited at an earlier point. I did not want to weigh this text down by giving the enigmatic lines which precede it, but I shall sketch out the sense of the omitted lines by restating Kojève's interpretation, without which the consequences, in spite of an appearance of relative clarity, would remain closed to us. For Hegel, it is both fundamental and altogether worthy of astonishment that human understanding, that is, language, discourse, should have had the force, an incomparable force, to separate its constitutive elements from the totality. These elements, this tree, this bird, this stone, are in fact inseparable from the whole. They are bound together by spatial and temporal, indeed material bonds which are indissoluble. Their separation implies a human negativity toward nature of which I spoke, without pointing out its decisive consequence. For the man who negates nature could not in any way live outside of it. He is not merely a man who negates nature, he is first of all an animal, that is to say, the very thing he negates. He cannot therefore negate nature without negating himself. The intrinsic totality of man is reflected in Kojève's bizarre expression that totality is first of all nature, natural being. It is the anthropomorphic animal. Nature, the animal indissolubly linked to the whole of nature and which supports man. Thus human negativity, man's effective desire to negate nature in destroying it, in reducing it to his own ends, as when, for example, he makes a tool of it, and the tool will be the model of an object isolated from nature, cannot stop at man himself. Insofar as he is nature, man is exposed to his own negativity. To negate nature is to negate the animal which props up man's negativity. It is undoubtedly not the understanding, breaker of nature's unity, which seeks man's death. And yet the separating action of the understanding implies a monstrous energy of thought, of the pure abstract I, which is essentially opposed to fusion, to the inseparable character of the elements, constitutive of the whole, which firmly upholds their separation. Yeah. So I agree.
Oh.
It's I mean, it wasn't clear back in those days. I mean, back in those days, people thought nature was infinite. You just go ahead and like, let's whack these trees and chop it all down. There's always more.
Yeah.
Not so today. Now you cut down the forest and we're all choking in smog. So, what you do to nature, you do to yourself. Here nature's being taken as a totality of nature. So, whatever you do to nature is also immediately being done to your body. So, the person who thinks that they're completely above nature, like, if they truly believe that, would also think themselves above their own body, and they would be the kind of fool that destroys the very thing which allows them to exist. And such fools exist, indeed. It's exactly because, they have this misconstrued idea of what they are. They really do seem to think that they are Descartes' disembodied mind. God knows why. So he says, it is undoubtedly not the understanding, breaker of nature's unity, which seeks man's death, and yet the separating action and understanding implies the monster's energy of thought of the pure abstract I, which is essentially opposed to fusion. I don't know if he's aware, but he said what he said is correct, I think. So maybe he was. Kojev seems to be aware, so he, like Bataille, is aware of it too. The monstrous power of thought is what? The power of abstraction. What is the power of abstraction? The power to break things away. So, the power of understanding is the power of thought, is the power of splitting, breaking things. Which makes that sentence weird because he says it is undoubtedly not the understanding which seeks man's death, because it seems to me that the implication right after is exactly that it is indeed the understanding that seeks man's death. Perhaps not, I suppose it's probably not as the form of understanding, but rather as a consequence of the understanding. It doesn't consciously seek to kill itself, but what it does ends up killing it. Continuing, it is the very separation of man's being, it is his isolation from nature, and consequently his isolation in the midst of his own kind, which condemn him to disappear definitively. The animal negating nothing, lost in the global animality to which it offers no opposition, just as that animality is itself lost in nature, and the totality of all that is, does not truly disappear. No doubt the individual fly dies, but today's flies are the same as those of last year. Last year's have died? Perhaps. But nothing has disappeared. The flies remain, equal to themselves like the waves of the sea. This seems contrived. A biologist can separate a fly from the swarm. All it takes is a brushstroke. But he separates it for himself. He does not separate it for the flies. To separate itself from the others, a fly would need the monstrous force of the understanding. Then it would name itself and do what the understanding normally effects by means of language, which alone founds the separation of elements, and by founding it founds itself on it within the world formed of separated and denominated entities. But in this game the human animal finds death. It finds precisely human death, the only one which frightens, which freezes, but which only frightens and transfixes the man who is absorbed in his future disappearance, to the extent that he is a separated and irreplaceable being. The only true death supposes separation, and through the disclosure which separates, the consciousness of being separated. So here what I'm understanding is it is the very separation of man's being, it is his isolation from nature. This definitely gets like a little bit of the Marxist tone, that the nature of man is social, but is to be a social being. Therefore, if man separates from nature, in full nature, he necessarily separates from his own nature, and therefore separates from other human individuals, which condemn him to disappear definitively. which is I mean, the way I suppose like the way to understand this is, the ultimate death, the absolute death, really is an individual who lives and dies alone, because they will be remembered by nobody. It's like the animal, it lives, it dies, except the lone human being has no species, can't even carry out its function of species being, can't reproduce, can't mate, have children, whatever, and so the lone individual, separated from all the individuals, dies not just a social death. Not only are they forgotten, they die a physical death. Or rather, I should reverse that. They don't just die a physical death. They also die a social death. They are not carried on as a part of spirit. Um, the example of the flies. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I suppose it's kind of showing how sociality and individuality play into each other, and that you definitely need thought in order to become an individual who then thinks themselves as an individual apart from the masses. But in doing so, you alienate yourself, and I think nothing is as telling as the modern day, where if you truly are an individual, your group of friends is very small. Mainly because, like genuine individuals, they don't go with the flow, they don't go with the crowds. Therefore, the common person, the normie, like they don't like them, and the individual doesn't like them. And they also enjoy the company. They find other individuals because individuals like individuals. They recognize each other, but it's not because they are this abstract new group, but rather like they're a determinate group. They know their differences. They enjoy their differences.
Yep.
But at the same time, if you separate yourself like that and you don't have anybody else to associate with, it's a pretty lonely world. You name yourself and then you make yourself an outcast, and that's actually that's a personal experience of mine in which for much of my high school, much of my school, like elementary through high school life, I was an outcast by my own doing, in which I considered myself different from other people, and therefore I just kind of separated myself off. I didn't do it consciously, but I did it, and I did conceive myself as different, an individual of sorts. So you definitely need language, you definitely need thought, you definitely need a conception in order to be able to do that. And by having this conception, you give yourself a ground which you can step on, and you say, "This is me. This is what I am. This is who I am. That is them." Blah blah blah. But in this game, the human animal finds death. It finds precisely human death, the only one which frightens, which freezes, but which only frightens and transfixes a man who is absorbed in his future disappearance, to the extent that he is separated an irreplaceable being. So that seems to make sense. I mean, I consider maybe you're the kind of person who's just like a hermit, right? You don't mind being alone, and you don't really care if people remember you or not. You just want them to leave you the fuck alone. So you go live in your cave in the mountains, be like Bodhidharma. Cut off your eyelids because you're tired of falling asleep, and they turn into tea leaves or whatever. If you've ever heard that myth. Yeah. Bodhidharma, by the way, was a gigantic asshole, but he was a boss.
Yeah.
I love the stories about him. He probably didn't exist. He just sounds like too fantastic, but he was a badass. He was basically like, he's like a Buddhist version of Diogenes, but way better. way
Yeah.
better. Because I mean, Diogenes was kind of like pretty disgusting. I mean, he's funny but disgusting, and like pretty
Yeah.
vulgar. But Bodhidharma is just kind of like the kind of like enlightened guy who just gives no fucks. Like one of the famous stories in the myths about him is that he's walking down, comes from India, goes to China. One of the emperors is like, "Oh, a holy man came from India." They're like, "Oh, invite the holy man." And they're like, "Well, who are you?" And he's like, "Well, I'm nobody." And like the emperor's like kind of like pissed off, and he's like, "Really, if you're nobody, who stands before me?" And Bodhidharma's like, "I don't know." And so like they gets mad, kicks him out, and Bodhidharma's like, "Whatever, man," just walks off. And then like the advisors come in, like, "Do you know who you kicked out?" And the emperor's like, "No, he was a fucking asshole, like fucking moron." And they're like, "You just kicked out Buddha, man. He's like holy man, God, does miracles, all this shit." And the emperor's like, "Go get him." And they're like, "You can send all of China before him. He ain't coming back." And then somewhere along the way, he like some guy starts an argument with him. Like, throws a rock at him, like nearly kills him, and that guy becomes his disciple. I don't know why, but I'm being terrible. I have a
Because
terrible
if you see
memory.
the Buddha, kill the Buddha.
Point is, go listen to them. You could probably listen to the Alan Watts has some talks on them. It's like they're pretty entertaining.
Yeah, I've heard them.
You can also just read them. They're pretty short. But either way, if you're Bodhidharma, you don't give a fuck if you're alone, and you don't give a fuck if people remember you. Well, if so, great for you. Nobody's gonna remember you, except they will if you're a badass. But you gotta make sure you're a badass in front of people. The only true death supposes separation, and through the discourse which separates the consciousness of being separated. Hmm. So I don't know. I mean, this kind of reminds me of like the Heideggerian point, about like Heidegger's whole like being toward death. That like you don't really you aren't really genuinely yourself if you don't come to terms and grips and the horror that you are going to die one day, and it could be tomorrow. And oh God, what are you gonna do if it's tomorrow? And well, you better do everything you actually wanted to do today. And then tomorrow comes, and you're like, oh God, well I didn't die today, but I could die tomorrow, so I better keep doing the things I want to do today.
Yeah.
But it's not this kind of thing.
No.
I think he's just talking about the death as. This reminds me of something that Jay Bernstein, his lectures, talks about, in which, well, I mean, he says like the only meaningful death is like the human death, which is the social death, the living death, which is the worst death of all because you're alive to be aware of that you died. Imagine being alive and nobody remember. It's like you wake up tomorrow and all your friends forget about you, and you go and you talk to them and they're like, "Who the hell are you?" And you're like, "Well, we were best friends. We're best buds." And, Piran says, like, "Fuck off, you weirdo." And, I'd be pretty damn sad. I'd be so sad I probably would actually kill myself because death is worse than that kind of death. I mean, death is less worse than the living death.
Like Babak, the story by Dostoevsky, where the dead are talking among themselves. It's good. You should read it sometime.
So the only true death, is only that the consciousness of being dead, I suppose. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that.
I don't know. It could be pretty cool.
Continuing impotent beauty hates the understanding. Up to this point, Hegel's text presents a simple and common truth, but one enunciated in a philosophical manner, which is, properly speaking, Sibling. Sibling? Sibling?
Yeah, Sibling.
Yeah.
For those who don't know that word, meaning me, Sibling is relating to or characteristic of a sibyl, that is a prophetic or mysterious
Like an oracle.
oracle, yeah.
Yeah.
In the passage from the preface cited above, Hegel, on the contrary, affirms and describes a personal moment of violence. Hegel, in other words, the sage, to whom an absolute knowledge has confirmed a definitive satisfaction. This is not an unbridled violence. What Hegel unleashes here is not the violence of nature, it is the energy or the violence of the understanding, the negativity of the understanding, opposing itself to the pure beauty of the dream, which cannot act, which is impotent. Indeed, the beauty of the dream is on that side of the world where nothing is yet separated from what surrounds it, where each element, in contrast to the abstract objects of the understanding, is given concretely in space and time. But beauty cannot act. It can only be and preserve itself. Through action, it would no longer exist, since action would first destroy what beauty is. Beauty, which seeks nothing, which is, which refuses to move itself, but which is disturbed by the force of the understanding. Moreover, beauty does not have the power to respond to the request of the understanding, which asks it to uphold and preserve the work of human death. Beauty is incapable of it, in the sense that to uphold that work, it would be engaged in action. Beauty is sovereign, it is an end, or it is not. That is why it is not susceptible to acting, why it is, even in principle, powerless, and why it cannot yield to the active negation of the understanding, which changes the world in itself, becomes other than it is. So, from what we read from the lectures in the philosophy of art, the concept of beauty as the unity of the concept of the work. I suppose. I mean, like the totality of the work is itself, immobile. It doesn't act. Once the work of art has been done, it's done. Whether it's the painting is complete, the statue is complete, the drama, the play, everything. Even though it's played out in time or read out in time, it's still itself already been completed. It has no further activity in itself for anything else. This beauty without consciousness of itself cannot therefore really, but not for the same reason as life, which recoils in horror from death and wants to save itself from annihilation, bear death and preserve itself in it. This impotent beauty at least suffers from feeling the breakup of the profoundly dissoluble totality of what is, of the concrete real. Beauty would like to remain the sign of an accord of the real with itself. It cannot become conscious negativity, awakened in dismemberment in the lucid gaze, absorbed in the negative. This latter attitude presupposes the violent and laborious struggle of man against nature and is its end. That is the historic struggle where man constitutes himself as subject or as abstract I of the understanding, as a separated and named being. That is to say, Kojève clarifies, that thought and discourse which reveals the real are born of the negative action which actualizes nothingness by annihilating being. The given being of man in the struggle, and the given being of nature through work, which results, moreover, from the real contact with death in the struggle. That is to say, therefore, that the human being himself is none other than that action. He is death which lives a human life. Sounds like a very Hegelian thing to say. There's this quote, I swear I read it somewhere, I heard it somewhere, and I've been trying to look for it for like the last 2 years, in which it's somebody mentioning something about Hegel in his Jena period, and that he was so successful doing dialectical just destructions of everything that his students called him the living death, of philosophy.
Yeah.
So continuing, I want to insist on the continual connection between an abyssal aspect and a tough, down-to-earth aspect in this philosophy, the only one having ambition to be complete. The divergent possibilities of opposed human figures confront each other and assemble in it. The figure of the dying man and of the proud one, who turns from death, the figure of the master and that of the man pinned to his work, the figure of the revolutionary and that of the skeptic, whose egotistical interests limits desire. This philosophy is not only a philosophy of death, it is also one of class struggle in work. But within the limits of this study, I do not intend to envisage its other side. I would like to compare the Hegelian doctrine of death with what we know about sacrifice. And we've been going for an hour. That's
We're halfway done, by the way. So.
All right, I think this is a good place to leave it. Just halfway, section 2, and
So
we'll
we
pick
can
it up.
finish that.
Yeah, we can pick it up some other time.
I mean, it gets a lot better for the second half. So.
Well, Jihe, you could have told us that instead of killing our time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait, what do you mean? Oh.
Well, by better, I mean more interesting, more dynamic, I guess.
I enjoyed this part. I just don't have a lot to say about it.
Yeah, it
Except
seemed
for,
it
I
was
agree.
more expository. He wasn't really
Yeah.
doing much commentary, but no, it was good. I mean, so far so good. I mean, I don't have much to disagree with. But okay, how long is it?
It's about 8 more pages, I guess. So if we were to read the whole thing, we'd probably be up for like another hour and a half, hour-ish. If you want to stay up that much,
I mean, I got nothing else to do, but
neither do I.
I mean, I do have to get up for work tomorrow, but I fall asleep like really, really late. I should probably buy myself a better pillow. Or maybe it's these goddamn radio waves inside this house. I sit pretty close to the Wi-Fi thing. And after watching that documentary about all these radio waves and transmission things that mess with people, I'm starting to become maybe that's why I don't sleep so well. Maybe that's why Balboa's Jr. has a weight problem. Maybe it messes with his little, what is it called? It's some gland, I forget what people call it.
Thyroid
Pineal gland?
Yeah, thyroid gland, there you go. Maybe it messes with his thyroid gland. Maybe it's not his fault after all. Poor fat boy. Yeah, okay, we'll see if we finish it.
Alright.
Continuing, section 2, sacrifice.
We're still recording, right?
Yeah.
Just making sure. Okay. Okay.
With that thyroid interlude, yeah.
Yeah.
My dog is cute, and there's nothing nobody will say about that.
He's our mascot, I guess.
Yeah, I posted pictures of him on Twitter. If you're if you're like some kind of stalker and you want to know what my dog looks like, just look through the stuff I posted on Twitter. Sacrifice on the one hand, and on the other, the gaze of Hegel absorbed in death and sacrifice. I shall not speak of the interpretation of sacrifice which Hegel gives in the chapter of Phenomenology, the Phenomenology devoted to religion. It no doubt makes sense in the development of the chapter, but it strays from the essential, and from the point of view of the theory of sacrifice, it is, in my opinion, of less interest than the implicit representation which is given in the text of the preface, and which I shall continue to analyze. Concerning sacrifice, I can essentially say that, on the level of Hegel's philosophy, man has, in a sense, revealed and founded human truth by sacrificing. In sacrifice, he destroyed the animal in himself, allowing himself and the animal to survive only as that non-corporeal truth which Hegel describes and which makes of man, in Heidegger's words, a being unto death. Or, in the words of Kojève himself, death which lives a human life. Actually, the problem of Hegel is given the action of sacrifice. In sacrifice, death, on the one hand, essentially strikes the corporeal being, and on the other hand, it is precisely in sacrifice that death lives a human life. It should even be said that sacrifice is the precise response to Hegel's requirement, the original formulation of which I repeat: spirit attains its truth only by finding itself in absolute dismemberment. It does not attain that prodigious power by being the positive that turns away from the negative. No, spirit is that power only in the degree to which it contemplates the negative face to face and dwells with it. If one takes into account the fact that the institution of sacrifice is practically universal, it is clear that negativity incarnated in man's death not only is the arbitrary construction of Hegel, but also has played a role in the spirit of the simplest men, without any common grounds comparable to those which are regulated once and for all by the ceremonies of a church, but nonetheless in a univocal manner. It is striking to see that across the world the communal negativity has maintained a strict parallelism in the development of rather stable institutions, which have the same form and the same effects. Whether he lives or dies, man cannot immediately know death. I shall speak later of the profound differences between the man of sacrifice acting in ignorance, unconscious, or the full scope of what he is doing, and the sage, Hegel, surrendering to the implications of a knowledge which, in his own eyes, is absolute. Despite these differences, the question of manifesting negative still remains, and still under the concrete form that is at the heart of the totality, whose constitutive elements are inseparable. The privileged manifestation of negativity is death, but death in fact reveals nothing. In theory, it is his natural animal being whose death reveals man to himself, but the revelation never takes place. For when the animal being supporting him dies, the human being himself ceases to be. In order for man to reveal himself ultimately to himself, he would have to die, but he would have to die to do it while but he would have to do it while living, watching himself ceasing to be. In other words, death itself would have to become self-consciousness at the very moment that it annihilates the conscious being. In a sense, this is what takes place, what at least is on the point of taking place, or which takes place in a fugitive, ungraspable manner, by means of a subterfuge. In the sacrifice, the sacrificer identifies himself with the animal that is struck down dead, and so he dies in seeing himself die, and even in a certain way, by his own will, one in spirit with the sacrificial weapon. But it is a comedy. Mhm. So when he says, in order for man to reveal himself ultimate to himself, he would have to die, but he would have to do it while living. I mean, in order for a person to know themselves completely, indeed, that will require their death.
Yeah.
It will require their final closure. Because until you really die, that closure doesn't really happen. And if that closure already happens while you're living, then you're pretty much dead in some way.
Yeah, so it couldn't happen.
If, for example, you have achieved a conceptual closure, you're intellectually dead from that point on. You're done. There's no more activity going on. You know, you've got your categories, you got your ways of thinking, and like now you know everything. Nobody can come up to you and like give you anything new to get you living again, because you know everything. So as far as that goes, you're dead. So you know yourself intellectually because well you're also intellectually dead, which goes to show you. I mean it's kind of obvious too. Who are the people who are open-minded? The people who just don't yet have a closed conceptual scheme. They're the people who always like searching new things. They're not sure of themselves. They're always open to something else. They're still alive. They're still seeking, still acting to learn. Can't say our scientists in general do that, or skeptics, or most people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in a metaphorical sense, one can understand that. Mm, Continuing, at least it would be a comedy if some other method existed which could reveal to the living the invasion of death, the finishing off of the finite being in which his negativity, which kills him, ends him, and definitively suppresses him, accomplishes alone in which it alone can accomplish. For Hegel, satisfaction can only take place, desire can be appeased only in the consciousness of death. If it were based on the exclusion of death, satisfaction would contradict that which death designates. If the satisfaction being, if the satisfied being who is not conscious, not early conscious, of what in a constitutive manner he is, that is, mortal, were eventually to be driven from satisfaction by death. That is why the consciousness that he has of himself must reflect, must mirror the movement of negativity which creates him, which makes a man of him for the very same reason that it will one day kill him. Hmm. So I'm not quite sure which way he's reading it here. I mean, like the way I'm reading it is I'm reading it from like at least the perspective that I know from the logic, in which, in order, of course, to have the consciousness which accords to the very negativity of consciousness, to that self-consciousness requires that one have the negativity of the concept. So the concept moves itself, just like desire moves itself, and consciousness, negates itself. Desire ends up negating itself through recognition. But finitude itself is a form of death, therefore, you are both already dead, and then one day you will also be temporally finite, and you will also just die, disintegrated by time. So, multiple levels of death ongoing. With Hegel, you're always dead, and you're always dying.
Yeah.
He will be killed by his own negativity, but for him, thereafter, there will be nothing left. His is a creative death, but if the consciousness of death, or the marvelous magic of death, does not touch him before he dies, during his life it will seem that death is not destined to reach him, and so the death awaiting him will not give him a human character. Thus, at all costs, man must live at the moment that he really dies, or he must live with the impression of really dying. Hmm. Sorry, rereading that slowly. Yeah. Okay, he will be killed by his own negativity, but for him, therefore, there will be nothing left. His is a creative death, but if the consciousness of death, the marvelous magic of death, does not touch him before he dies, during his life it will seem that death is not destined to reach him, and so the death awaiting him will not give him a human character. Okay, I'm not quite sure what he means here.
Which part?
Oh, that entire paragraph, like last little paragraph right there. I'm not sure like how he's meaning death. Like if he's talking about a literal death, he's talking about a conscious death, and like the conscious
The
death of
knowledge.
what?
I think it's talking about the knowledge that he will die if he just dies, and if he doesn't realize it before he dies, then, you know. it seems like he's never going to die, and his death will become sort of like a wait, I didn't know this was going to happen type thing, and it'll be overwhelming. I don't know. And he never gets to fully live as human. I mean, he said that earlier in the thing that you never fully live as human without realizing your own finitude, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, it does not give him a human character. I don't know. I mean,
Gives him an animal character.
Yeah,
That's
animals
is
don't
yeah,
really
that's
never
what he
is
die.
that
says. Yeah.
oh, okay, okay. Thank you. That makes perfect sense. I was being way more abstract about that.
Oh.
I was thinking about it like, you know, and just like the whole social aspect. You know, like I was thinking like say like Alexander the Great, who just like suddenly uh, suddenly dies, and like can we consider like that not a human death or something or whatever? Uh, did no one else like see that as like somehow tragic or something? That seems pretty human to me, but at the same time, I suppose it's from the perspective of them, and the animals, lives and dies, and is not aware of the meaning of death. Because I mean, animals do have an awareness that they will die. A lot of them, have behaviors in which they'll crawl off on their own, find a little hole, and like lay there, die, etc. But they don't conceive the implications of the meaning of death. So yeah, what you said about animals and the human characters, perfectly clear.
Not Turritopsis dorni, though, the infinite jellyfish.
Knowledge of death cannot do without a subterfuge, spectacle. This difficulty proclaims the necessity of spectacle or of representation in general, without the practice of which it would be possible for us to remain alien and ignorant in respect to death, just as beasts apparently are. Indeed, nothing is less animal than fiction, which is more or less separated from the real from death. Man does not live by bread alone, but also by the comedies with which he willingly deceives himself. In man it is the animal, it is the natural being which eats, but man takes part in rites and performances, or else he can read. To the extent that it is sovereign, authentic, literature prolongs in him the haunting magic of performances, tragic or comic.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I completely agree. It reminds me of what Marx says. It's not just in the biological needs that man exists. That those are actually not just merely the animal needs. The human needs or the cultural needs. It's not just that you eat. It's that you eat cake. It's that you eat tacos on Tuesdays because they're on specials. It's that you eat wedding cakes at weddings. It's that you eat turkeys on Thanksgiving. It's not just eating for merely eating. It's eating in a human way.
It's eating with a I guess a meaning or a purpose attached to it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's big, but yeah.
A spectacle, yeah.
Yeah.
To occupy our time.
In tragedy, at least, it is a question of our identifying with such character who dies and of believing that we die, although we are alive. Furthermore, pure and simple imagination suffices, but it has the same meaning as the classic subterfuges, performances, or books to which the masses have recourse. I just never had that impression. Like, I don't know other people, but I watch something or I read something, and like a character dies or something, and whether it's tragic or it's comic, I've never had that feeling in that I identify their death with mine. Like, at least never directly. I don't feel like. I mean, I feel sad because like I like the character. Like I think like the whole thing is tragic, but I never get this feeling of identification, which a lot of people talk about. And I don't know.
I have identification with Hegel and Pessoa, but they were real, so they're not characters. It's just that characters are usually too one-dimensional, you know? Maybe they have multiple dimensions, but they're not adequate, I mean, most of the time. Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh.
Continuing, agreement and disagreement between naive behaviors and Hegel's lucid reaction. By associating it with the sacrifice, and thereby with the primary theme of representation in art, in festivals, and performances, I have sought to demonstrate that Hegel's reaction is fundamental human behavior. It is not a fantasy or strange attitude, it is par excellence the expression endlessly repeated by tradition. It is not Hegel alone, it is all of humanity which everywhere always sought obliquely to seize what death both gave and took away from humanity. Between Hegel and the man of sacrifice there nevertheless remains a profound difference. Hegel was conscious of his representation of the negative. He situated it lucidly in a definite point of the coherent discourse which revealed him to himself. The totality included the discourse which reveals it. The man of sacrifice, who lacked a discursive consciousness of what he did, had only a sensual awareness, that is, an obscure one reduced to an unintelligible emotion. It is true that Hegel himself, beyond discourse, and in spite of himself, in an absolute dismemberment, received the shock of death even more violently above all, for the primary reason that the broad movement of discourse extended its reach beyond limits, that is, within the framework of the totality of the real. Beyond the slightest doubt for Hegel, the fact that he was still alive was simply an aggravation. The man of sacrifice, on the other hand, maintains his life essentially. He maintains it only in the sense that life is necessary for the representation of death, but also in the sense that he seeks to enrich it. But from an external perspective, the palpable and intentional excitement of sacrifice was a greater interest than the involuntary sensitivity of Hegel. The excitement of which I speak is well known, is definable. It is sacred horror, the richest and the most agonizing experience which does not limit itself to dismemberment, but which, on the contrary, opens itself like a theater curtain on a realm beyond this world, where the rising light of day transfigures all things and destroys their limited meaning. Okay, like, I feel like a bit lost here. Like all of a sudden he brings in the person of sacrifice, and where did this come in? Like, wait, was this whole little section before this about that? Somehow I missed it.
I don't know, he just says it.
Yeah, it just seems to come out of nowhere. I mean, I don't remember him mentioning like a man of sacrifice before. I mean,
He's
the
talking about
spectacle and
the
representation, is that the sacrifice?
well, he's talking about the man performing the sacrifice, I guess.
And did you do?
I remember he said something about by killing an animal, sacrificing, you sacrifice yourself, but that's it.
Let's see, this difficulty proclaims the necessity of spectacle, or the representation in general, without the practice of which it would be possible for us to remain alien and ignorant in respect to death, just as beasts apparently are. Indeed, nothing is less animal than fiction, which is more or less separated from the real, from death. Man does not live by bread alone, but also by the comedies by which he is willingly deceives himself. In man, it is the animal, it is the natural being which eats. In tragedy, at least, it is a question of our identifying with some character who dies and of believing that we die, although we are alive. For the more pure and simple imagination suffices, but it has the same meaning as the classic subterfuge performances or books to which Okay, by associating it with sacrifice and thereby with a primary theme of representation, I have sought to demonstrate that Hegel's reaction is fundamental human behavior. So Hegel's reaction of, the death negativity is now being associated with sacrifice, because I know you mentioned that stuff earlier. Um, representation in art and festivals and performances. I have sought to demonstrate that Hegel's reaction is fundamental human behavior. It is not a fantasy or strange attitude. It is par excellence the expression of endlessly repeated by tradition. It is not Hegel alone. It is all of humanity, which everywhere always sought obliquely to seize what death gave and took away from humanity. Between Hegel and the man of sacrifice, there nevertheless remains a profound difference. Hegel was conscious of his representation of the negative. He situated it lucidly in a definite point of the coherent discourse which revealed him to himself. That totality included the discourse which reveals it. The man of sacrifice, who lacked a discursive consciousness of what he did, had only sensual awareness, that is, an obscure one reduced to an unintelligible emotion. It is true that Hegel himself, beyond discourse, and in spite of himself in an absolute dismemberment, received the shock of death even more violently. Okay, so Hegel's aware of death, aware of the negativity, represents it to himself, is aware of the representation. The man of sacrifice does not. It only has sensuous awareness, can only feel it.
But the man of sacrifice just does it. He doesn't understand the whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More violently above all for the primary reason that the broad movement of discourse extended its reach beyond limits, that is, within the framework of the totality of the real. So, Hegel's absolute idealism reaches beyond itself, beyond the slightest doubt. For Hegel, the fact that he was still alive was simply an aggravation. This seems like one of those critiques of, the system being incomplete. And so, you complete the system, you complete the logic, there shouldn't be anything left to do, and yet, wait a minute, there's nature, wait a minute, there's spirit, wait a minute, and then finally there's the real, that kind of thing. At least that's the impression I'm getting.
Well, when I should point out for the readers, or the listeners, that when he mentions the real, he's just talking about reality.
Yeah.
He's not talking about the Lacanian real or anything. Yeah.
Beyond the slightest doubt, for Hegel, the fact that he was still alive was simply an aggravation. The man of sacrifice, on the other hand, maintains his life essentially. He maintains it not only in the sense that life is necessary for the representation of death, but also in the sense that he seeks to enrich it. But from an external perspective, the palpable intentional excitement of sacrifice was of greater interest than the involuntary sensitivity of Hegel. The excitement of which I speak is well known, it is definable, it is sacred horror, the richest and the most agonizing experience, which does not limit itself to dismemberment, but which on the contrary opens itself like a theater curtain onto a realm beyond the world, where the rising light of day transfigures all things and destroys their limited meaning. Being honest, I don't know what he means by sacred horror. I mean, I know there's certain mystical experiences in which people just they have, for example, the typical nirvanic no self experience, but instead of being this bliss, it's this horror of just being torn apart and nothing there. But I don't know if he's talking about anything like that.
I think so. It has to be something close to it.
Yeah.
The richest and most agonizing experience. It's the most possible, but you don't like it. It's something horrible to you.
I mean, what is it called? Ecstasy. What is that
What
one?
about
Well, yeah, the the old concept of ecstasy, like not the drug. Like
Yeah.
people nowadays don't misuse the word. It doesn't mean, or rather, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. What is it that one saint that she had the ecstasy and she saw Jesus, and like her experience was that like they plunged like
Saint Teresa.
something to like into her chest, like through her heart,
Yeah.
and that was her ecstasy.
Yeah.
An ecstatic experience. So yeah, something like that. Seems like it. It's a beautiful yet horrible thing. So the man of sacrifice, rebels in this, whereas Hegel would, according to Bataille, Hegel would rather like remain in pure logic and reason and like not deal with any of the emotional stuff, sensuous stuff. Continuing, indeed, if Hegel's attitude opposes learned consciousness and the limitless organization of a discursive thinking to the naivete of sacrifice, still that consciousness and that organization remain unclear on one point. One cannot say that Hegel was unaware of the moment of sacrifice. This moment is included, implicated in the whole movement of the phenomenology, where it is the negativity of death insofar as it is assumed, which makes a man of the human animal. But because he did not see that sacrifice in itself bore witness to the entire movement of death, the final experience, the one peculiar to the sage, described in the preface to the Phenomenology, was at first initial and universal. He did not know to what extent he was right. With what precision he described the intimate movement of negativity, he did not clearly separate death from the feeling of sadness to which naive experience opposes a sort of shunting yard of the emotions. So when he says, indeed, if Hegel's attitude opposes learned consciousness, the only thing that comes to mind is that Hegel's opposition to phenomenology is between absolute knowing and the natural forms of consciousness, natural consciousness, which is the subject-object divide. Well, various other divides, but one of the biggest ones, the subject-substance divide. And the limitless organization of discursive thinking to the naivety of sacrifice. I frankly don't know what he means by that. I don't see that like just throughout the phenomenology, at least in what we read. And what he says here, I don't know. It seems just like not clear enough for me. Well, it's not clear enough for me. I don't know if it seems like that to you. Still, that consciousness and the organization remain unclear on one point. One cannot say that Hegel was unaware of the moment of sacrifice. This moment is included, implicated in the whole movement of phenomenology, where it is the negativity of death, insofar as it is assumed, which makes a man of the human animal. So, when you have the moment of the negativity, which, causes dialectic to, um, to occur, the only moment of sacrifice I can think of is where one gives up, one gets to that dialectic and gives up that notion that one had. But it's not a pure or a mere sacrifice, because it's a sacrifice that actually purifies. It's not like offering a goat to the gods, in which like, at the end of the day all you have is charred bones, if anything at all, the ashes.
Yeah,
But
but you get their
rather,
blessing in return.
oh yeah, but like with Hegel, it's more like like purifying metal. It's like
Yeah, metallurgy.
you have you start out with like this rough ore, multiple metals, and basically the phenomenology is one giant process of refining, separating the different metals within that ore. And, as the further you go, the more pure and pure the metal gets.
Yeah. Until you end up with orichalcum.
Yep.
I don't think he's saying it's a bad thing. I don't think he's using sacrifices like as a negative here.
No, but
No,
I'm just saying I
no.
don't know what like the critique is because I
Oh,
wasn't
okay.
sure like how he was using it.
Well, he said that Hegel was not unaware.
But because he did not see that sacrifice in itself bore witness to the entire movement of death, the final experience, the one peculiar to the sage described in the preface to Phenomenology, was at first initial and universal. He did not know to what extent he was right, with what precision he described the intimate movement of negativity. He did not clearly separate death from the feeling of sadness, to which naive experience supposes a sort of shunting yard of the emotions. I don't get his point.
Yeah, me either. To be honest.
I mean, because it's no more than like noticing, people will say like, oh, the real secret of Hegel is love. That the entire that like the real, the dialectic can be understood through the concept of love. And yeah, I mean, you can do this
Yeah.
with just about anything. Like anything within the
Yeah, I don't
system
know.
can literally be used as the sort of conceptual image of the entire system as a whole, insofar as it is properly a dialectic. And that's all you need. You need is a dialectic that has the infinite movement, and that's it.
Love is all you need.
Yeah. So I mean, Hegel himself does it, by the way. I mean, like there's multiple across the various things he writes. He went from like it's all day, everything's just a process of death, to then everything's a process of love, to then everything is God, then everything's just a concept, and it doesn't matter what you call it. I mean, it's the same thing.
Yeah,
Like
same shit.
there's nothing like the term you use, will emphasize certain aspects of it, which flavors it, I suppose. Uh, but that's it. Like there's nothing. I don't really think there's anything deeper to be gleaned in like considering the whole entire movement as movement of death. It sounds amazing, and I think it's very insightful to bring it up. Hegel says in his early writings, which were unpublished, the Spirit of Christianity and its Fate, that to name, when Adam names the animal, he kills him. That's a pretty great insight. It's a metaphorical, ontological, metaphysical meaning, logical, and it's interesting. It's more people ought to say things like that. It sounds beautiful,
Yeah.
but other than that, I don't get his point.
Is it because he perturbs it?
He says he clearly did not separate death from the feeling of sadness. He didn't see death as this ontological, this purely logical ontological thing, as opposed to he still mixed it up with the empirical muddledness of a feeling. But I think that when you mention things as death, that's exactly what you want. You say it because you want that to give that visceral feeling. To give that little oomph to the concept.
Mm-hmm.
Pleasure in the sadness of death. It was precisely the univocal character of death for Hegel that inspired the following commentary from Kojève, which applies again to the passage from the preface. Certainly, the idea of death does not heighten the well-being of man. It does not make him happy, nor does it give him any pleasure. Kojève wondered in what way satisfaction results from a familiarity with a negative, with a tête-à-tête with death. He believed it his duty, out of decency, to reject vulgar satisfaction. The fact that Hegel himself said in this respect that spirit only attains its truth by finding itself in absolute dismemberment goes together in principle with Kojève's negation. Consequently, it would even be superfluous to insist, Kojev simply states, that the idea of death is alone capable of satisfying man's pride. Indeed, the desire to be recognized, which Hegel places at the origin of historical struggles, could be expressed in an intrepid attitude of the sort that shows a character to its best advantage. It is only, says Kojev, in being or in becoming aware of one's mortality or finitude, in existing and in feeling one's existence in a universe without a beyond or without a God, that man can affirm his liberty, his historicity, and his individuality, unique in all the world, and have them be recognized. But if Kojev sets aside vulgar satisfaction, happiness, he now also sets aside Hegel's absolute dismemberment. Indeed, such dismemberment is not easily reconciled with the desire for recognition. Satisfaction and dismemberment coincide, however, in one point, but here they harmonize with pleasure. The coincidence takes place in sacrifice. It is generally understood as the naive form of life, as every existence in present time, which manifests what man is, the novelty which he signifies in the world after he has become man, on the condition that he has satisfied his animal needs.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. So, I mean, just a note on the whole the quote about the dismemberment from Hegel. All that is just like a flowery way of talking about difference in unity. You know, difference. Spirit only finds its unity by having true differences, and having true differences mean having true individualities, and having true individualities means to have two things that really are other. You know,
Yeah,
that can exist in a way independent of each other as
yeah.
others. And so,
They exist parallel. They're not like overreaching one another or something.
yeah, and so spirit is this thing which is an absolute unity in absolute difference.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely unified, but it's absolutely dismembered as well.
Yeah, it's really
You, the
different.
individual human, the individual consciousness, indeed are absolutely other to every other individual human consciousness.
Yeah.
Sorry, dogs are crazy. So yeah, if anyone thought that Hegel's whole philosophy is like, oh well, everything is one, and that nobody's really alone. No, no, that's that's exactly the opposite. You can indeed be completely alone, and sucks to be you. Uh, which, by
Yeah.
the way, I mean, like, and I take this mostly from the Bernstein lectures, Jay Bernstein. I forget which lecture it is, but he talks about it's somewhere around the lectures of the Master Slave, and I think I had my own original thoughts on that, which were independent of his when we read it. Which in which Hegel does talk about the whole thing about the impenetrability of consciousness. That a consciousness cannot be penetrated by anything, not even another consciousness, without its will. And even if it can be penetrated, it can't be forced to will something within it. Maybe you can somehow
Yeah.
shoot a ray to make somebody like fall in love with you, but that does not immediately make them will to want to be in love with you. Like, I don't know if you ever had like you met anyone that has that weird conundrum in which like they're in love with somebody that they hate and they don't want to be in love with them. So something like that is
Oh,
possible.
yeah, I suppose so.
So even in that scenario where you can somehow invade somebody's like emotional consciousness, you still can't penetrate the rational consciousness.
Yeah. That's why a lot of people ignore other people. They literally are not acknowledging them enough to allow the consciousness to penetrate.
Continuing, at any rate, pleasure, or at least sensual pleasure, is such that in respect to it, Kojève's affirmation would be difficult to uphold, as opposed to, ghostly pleasures. I wonder what those are like.
What?
Ghostly pleasures.
Where's ghostly pleasures?
Well, hey, if you have to determine a sensual pleasure, maybe there are ghostly, immaterial,
Okay.
non-sensual pleasures.
Well, of course there are.
It's kind of like a ghost coming and tickling your soul or something.
That's what the happiness of thought is.
Well, if you want to be rational about it.
I don't know. Where are we?
Bottom of 289.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it now.
At any rate, pleasure, or at least sensual pleasure, is such that in respect to it, Kojève's affirmation would be difficult to uphold. The idea of death helps, in a certain manner, and in certain cases, to multiply the pleasures of the senses. I go so far as to believe that, under the form of defilement, the world, or rather the general imagery, of death is at the base of eroticism. The feeling of sin is connected in lucid consciousness to the idea of death, and in the same manner the feeling of sin is connected with pleasure. Now we're getting somewhere.
Yeah.
Now we're getting to real
Told
Bataille.
you.
All this roundabout just so he could say, look, man.
Yeah, but all his just fucking and weak shit is nothing compared to even one good piece of Hegelian dialectic.
Zizek. There is in fact no human pleasure without some irregularity in circumstances, without the breaking of interdiction, the simplest and the most powerful of which is currently that of nudity. I don't know, man. When I have the pleasure, when I have the pleasure of thinking and writing my my silly blogs and stuff, I don't think I'm having pleasure because I'm somehow breaking some taboo. I'm just having fun.
You're doing it wrong.
I mean, it's
you're not pushing any boundaries.
Yeah, in fact, the few times where I felt I've been pushing boundaries with Hegel, it's creeped me out. It's not giving me pleasure. It's being you start reading the a little section from the Absolute Idea, and it's like you're approaching Cthulhu.
That's the sacred horror.
I suppose.
Oh.
As Space says, fair enough. I mean, just to go on with that, I've also had ecstatic moments of Hegel, in which I literally had 2 moments somewhere within my first year of really getting to Hegel, where I got high and I don't even know reading reading random snippets of Hegel, at fucking 12 a.m. at night, and all of a sudden you read this and you're like, wow, that's amazing. Sorry.
Yeah,
and I just got so elated, I wanted to get out of my seat and run outside at midnight.
Yeah, it's
just filled me with energy. I was just it's awesome.
If I'm reading something and I don't feel like I'm reading some sort of sacred tome that I'm not supposed to be reading, and that's sometimes how reading his philosophy and some of the books I've read, that's how it feels, and that's the best feeling, I think. Like you're discovering some sort of arcane knowledge or something, yeah.
But that only happened to me with the Absolute Idea, mainly because it was unthinkable for me at that point. It's basically the concept of conceiving concepts, and I was like, what? And it kept turning in my head, and the more I thought I got it, the less it made sense, and the more eerie it got. And I thought maybe this doesn't make sense because it's like Cthulhu, it's like the Necronomicon. The more you know about it, the closer to the other worlds that you are, and the old gods and whatnot.
The madness.
Continuing, moreover, possession was associated in its time with the image of sacrifice. It was sacrifice in which woman was a victim. That association from ancient poetry is very meaningful. It refers back to a precise state of sensibility in which the sacrificial element, the feeling of sacred horror itself, joined in a weakened state to a tempered pleasure, in which too the taste for sacrifice and the emotion which it released seemed in no way contrary to the ultimate use of pleasure. It must be said that too that sacrifice, like tragedy, was an element of a celebration. It bespoke a blind, pernicious joy and all the danger of that joy, and yet this precisely is the principle of human joy. It wears out and threatens with death all who get caught up in its movement. Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose, like, I can't say I know or have heard of any, like, like rational, controlled hedonists, besides, weirdos like the utilitarian Australian guy.
There's Singer.
Yeah, that guy. I'm pretty sure
Peter
that
Singer.
guy goes around, tallying up his little utilitons, of perversity.
Today I
What today
gave a pig a truffle.
Up his anus.
Oh god. Yeah. You're just. You're just.
Well, I waked him with a corn cob.
You're referencing how earlier there was a thread on what's it called? You sent it to me. What was it? Reddit.
Yeah.
The Reddit thread where it was like, if you want to understand Marx, listen to Peter Singer. That was like, if I want to understand utilitarianism, I'll read The Pokey Little Puppy.
Like I don't even know anything the guy's ever written. Like all his stuff is like honestly like really terrible arguments.
Yeah.
Like he's famous.
I've seen those lectures before.
Like he's famous, and like people don't even know what he's famous for, other than like he's the utilitarian guy. And
He's the guy.
Yeah, he's the guy who's like, we gotta give everything to the children in Africa. And like everybody's like, the liberals read it and they're like, they're kind of shifty in their seats and they're like, well, it's just not feasible. That's kind of crazy. And then he was the animal rights guy and he's like, we gotta stop eating animals. And people are like, but I like my burgers and my lobsters. And then like he didn't really come up with any novel arguments or anything. I mean, he's just kind of like a typical, he's like. Room temperature water, like Jesus said, you don't want to swallow it and you just want to spit it out.
Yeah.
All right. Gay anguish, anguished gaiety. Not to be confused with homosexual anguish.
Yeah, which we all have, I'm sure. Right? I don't know.
To the association of death and pleasure, which is not a given, at least is not an immediate given in consciousness, is obviously opposed to sadness of death, always in the background of consciousness. In principle, consciously, humanity recoils in horror before death. In principle, the destructive effects of negativity have nature as their object. But for man's negativity to drive him into a confrontation with danger, for him to make of himself, or at least of the animal, of the natural being that he is, the object of his destructive negation, the banal prerequisite is his unconsciousness of the cause and the effect of his actions. Now it was essential for Hegel to gain consciousness of negativity as such, to capture its horror, hear the horror of death, by upholding and by looking the work of death right in the face. Hegel in this way is less opposed to those who recoil than those who say it is nothing. He seems to distance himself most from those who react with gaiety. So, what are those Greeks who said, like, I'm not afraid of death, I wasn't alive before I was born and I won't be alive when I'm dead. Hegel says,
I had no
begun.
I had no knowledge of being alive before I was alive. and I'll have no knowledge after.
Yeah, goddamn Epicurus and his hippie comment. I mean, just kind of going to side on like the whole negativity thing. Yeah, I think a lot of like his whole thing about like what he said about all things kind of having this basis in this kind of perversity of sinning. I think that's just kind of I think that's just him like way overplaying it. That's kind of obviously wrong. Yes, there's people who kind of reduce their lives that way, but most people just don't seem to. I mean, there's plenty of pleasures that people have which have nothing to do with it. I mean, like competition, for example, has nothing to do with some sort of like weird sin or defiling things. There is an aspect of negation, of destruction, but destruction is merely ideal, which is perfect. It's exactly why we kind of like sports. It's kind of like war without war. You get to kill people with points, but not in flesh. Except for football, you get to kill their brains with bashing their helmets and whatnot. But hey, they get paid millions. They're aware of the dangers. It's capitalism.
Well, too, like I said, Bataille's whole his work is primarily about taboos and about transgression. In that sense, that's what
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
his thing. I want to emphasize as clear as possible, after their similarity, the opposition between the naive attitude and that of the absolute wisdom of Hegel. I am not sure, in fact, that in the two attitudes the more naive is the less absolute. I shall cite a paradoxical example of a gay reaction in the face of the work of death. The Irish and Welsh custom of the wake is little known, but was still practiced at the end of the last century. It is the subject of Joyce's last work, Finnegan's Wake. The Death Watch of Finnegan.
Well, this came out of nowhere.
What?
Oh.
It's just an example.
Well, I love James Joyce. But, however, the reading of this famous novel is difficult at best.
Isn't it that like only like the true and pure Irish can understand it?
No, that's Ulysses. Well, maybe that too. I don't know, but like it's barely comprehensible. It's just okay. I don't. Do you really want me to explain?
No, I don't.
No.
Save for
Okay.
another time.
We're really going on tangents here, guys. Sorry.
All
but,
right.
Yeah.
In Wales, the coffin was placed open, standing at the place of honor of the house. The dead man would be dressed in his finest suit and top hat. His family would invite all his friends, who honored the departed, all the more the longer they danced and the deeper they drank, to his house. It is the death of an other, but in such instances the death of the other is always the image of one's own death. Only under one condition could anyone so rejoice: with the presumed agreement of the dead man, who is an other. The dead man, the drinker, in his turn will become and shall have no other meaning than his predecessor. I don't get the paradox. I mean, I suppose it's people celebrating death, but I guess at face value is paradoxical, but I don't really see any central paradox.
What, in the wake?
Well, they're coming to terms with death, or like sorry, it's.
He's like the guest of honor in the place.
Well, the fact
Like,
that
"Hey,
they're
look who's dead."
celebrating,
Yeah,
they're
I mean,
celebrating the death of this. Yeah, it's. Or they're behaving in a manner that's that's representative of celebration, and yet this is supposed to be a very somber moment of a death, and
yeah. I mean, like I get that. It's just like I don't know. Maybe it's just because like I come. Like I read mystical stuff on this before, and so like in mysticism, this so-called paradox isn't a paradox at all. But like it's kind of like it's the common trope. You know, for
Mm-hmm.
example, in India, there's this one group of people who, when you're born, they mourn, and when you die, they party. Because when you're born, they're
Uh-huh.
mourning that you're gonna suffer all your life and you're gonna have all these problems. But when you're dead, all your problems are gone. You're
Mhm.
back to the essence of God. Blah blah blah. People party around your grave.
Yeah, it's like that poem by Mary Elizabeth Fry, "Do not weep at my grave," or whatever, for I am not there, or so and stuff.
So yeah, so I mean, the death isn't final. But then Hegel, as far as I'm aware, I mean, Hegel also didn't think that death was final. Uh, in that, clearly, if there's death, there must be life. So immediately from death springs back life.
Mm-hmm.
And whether I have no idea, since I haven't read the stuff on the philosophy of religion. I wouldn't know what he says about the soul and whether he thinks that the individual themselves actually persists or not.
You don't think he
According
believes in a
according to
transmigration of the soul?
yeah, according to Ken Folds, he thinks that Hegel says yes. According to most of
Also,
everybody else, they say no.
I don't know. I
So
mean, we'll
yeah,
never know what he really thought.
I don't know. I think it's more or less clear if you read it charitably. I mean, like you can't miss things if he does have a transmigration theory, he must, or at least not a reincarnation thing. I don't know if it would be reincarnation, but he'd like an afterlife kind of thing. He'd have to have something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it wouldn't be hard to miss. So this paradoxical reaction could be considered a response to the desire to deny the existence of death, a logical desire? Not in the least, I think. In Mexico today, death is commonly envisaged on the same level as the amusements that can be found at festivals: skeleton puppets, skeleton candy, skeleton merry-go-rounds. But this custom is associated with an intense cult of the dead, a visible obsession with death. If I envisage death gaily, it is not that I too say, in turning away from what is frightening, it is nothing, or it is false. On the contrary, gaiety connected with the work of death causes me anguish, is accentuated by my anguish, and in return exacerbates that anguish. Ultimately, gay anguish, anguished gaiety, causes me, in a feverish chill, absolute dismemberment. Where it is my joy that finally tears me apart, but where the dejection follow joy, were I not torn all the way to the end immeasurably. There is one precise
It's pretty deep.
opposition that I would like to bring out fully. On the one hand, Hegel's attitude is less whole than that of naive humanity, but this is meaningless unless reciprocally one sees that the naive attitude is powerless to maintain itself without subterfuge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. I don't
Well,
quite see it the way he sees it, in which the cult of the dead, it's some kind of this absolute othering thing as well. Um, how could it be? I mean, like, for example, in Mexico, come on, like, the cult of the dead is cult of the dead for a reason. Like, people believe that if you die, unfortunately, you're still not off our backs.
yeah.
If you lived a shitty life, old grandpa's gonna come a knocking and gonna fuck you up, unless you get the witch doctor. Like, please find out what the hell he wants and finally please him, get the fuck off. And as opposed to, if you have, your old grandpa dies or grandma dies and they were the witch doctor or the shaman or whatever, or they were the priest, you pray to them as well. They kind of become a sort of saint. You ask them for blessings, you ask them for help, and, they're there. So, they're still part of your communities. So, there is no absolute dismemberment at all. Literally the entire community is deathless. Everybody's just constantly carried forever. Nobody ever dies. Neither because they believe it metaphysically, nor in memory.
Mm-hmm.
So, at least with that example, I don't think that example fits well with his idea that an absolute joy, that knowing that they really haven't died. I'm somehow dismembered immeasurably. I don't know. I don't see it. I can't imagine it.
People mourn in weird ways, though.
I mean, like, the only way I can imagine that you'd be happy in a way that you were also just immeasurably torn and dismembered is literally
Yeah.
like that you were happy someone was alive, and yet you could no longer ever commune with them again.
Yeah. You have
that
the happy
you know,
memories of them.
it's like you know they're alive, but you can't be with them. You can't contact them. You can't do anything with them. So
Yeah.
there's someone you loved, but you're infinitely separate. No longer this whatever. It's kind of like your family member disappears out of nowhere one day. You don't know where they went. Maybe God took them away. Aliens, dimensions. They fell into a
Fell
hole.
through a
God
portal.
knows. Yeah, fell through a portal. God knows what. Either way, you have this hope that you believe that they're alive, but you also, that's a nice feeling, but it's also a terrible feeling in that you know that they're alive somewhere, and yet you can never ever again see them. That's the only time I think like that example seems to work.
Okay.
But Mexico is not the one place where that happens, because you can just go to your local shaman and you can talk to old grandpa. So there is one precise opposition I would like to bring out fully. On the one hand, Hegel's attitude is let hold on. Okay, already did that. Discourse gives useful ends to sacrifice afterwards. I have linked the meaning of sacrifice to man's behavior once his animal needs have been satisfied. Man differs from the natural being in which he also is. The sacrificial gesture is what he humanly is, and the spectacle of sacrifice that makes his humanity manifest. Freed from animal need, man is sovereign. He does what he pleases, his pleasure. Yeah, I guess, sucks on his thumb and diddles his bum, or according to Bataille. Bad joke. Natural being. Under these conditions, he is finally able to make rigorously autonomous gestures so long as he needed to satisfy animal needs. He had to act with an end in view. He had to secure food, protect himself from the cold. This supposes a servitude, a series of acts subordinated to a final result, a natural animal satisfaction, without which man, properly speaking, sovereign man, could not subsist. But man's intelligence, his discursive thought, developed as functions as servile labor. Only sacred, poetic words, limited to the level of impotent beauty, have retained the power to manifest full sovereignty. Sacrifice, consequently, is a sovereign, autonomous manner of being only to the extent that it is uninformed by meaningful discourse. Sorry about that. Meaningful to the extent that discourse informs it. What is sovereign is given in terms of servitude. Indeed, by definition, what is sovereign does not serve. But simple discourse must respond to the question that discursive thought asks concerning the meaning that each thing must have on the level of utility. In principle, each thing is there to serve some purpose or other. Thus, the simple manifestation of man's link to annihilation, the pure revelation of man to himself at the moment when death transfixes his attention, passes from sovereignty to the primacy of servile ends. Myth associated with ritual had at first the impotent beauty of poetry, but discourse concerning sacrifice slipped into vulgar, self-serving interpretation. Starting with effects naively imagined on the level of poetry, such as the appeasing of a god or the purity of beings, the end of meaningful discourse became the abundance of rain of the city or the city's well-being. The substantial work of Fraser, who recalls those forms of sovereignty that were the most impotent and apparently the least propitious for happiness, generally tends to reduce the meaning of the ritual act to the same purposes as labor in the fields and to make of sacrifice an agrarian right. Today, that thesis of the golden bow is discredited, but it seemed reasonable insofar as the same people who sacrificed inscribed sovereign sacrifice within the frame of a language of plowmen. It is true that in every arbitrary manner which never merited the credence of rigorous reason, these people attempted and must have labored to submit sacrifice to the laws of action, laws to which they themselves were submitted or labored to submit themselves. So only sacred poetic words limited to the level of impotent beauty have retained the power to manifest full sovereignty. Sacrifice, consequently, is a sovereign, autonomous manner of being only to the extent that it is uninformed by meaningful discourse. Okay, I mean, like, he's right, but when does that happen? I mean, I can't think of an example where somebody sacrifices without any point of sacrificing. That doesn't make sense to me. Does I mean to talk about sacrifice? Sacrifice is always by concept, as far as I conceive it, and I could be wrong. To require towards something. Sacrifice is always sacrifice for something. You just don't have sacrifice. You go out into the woods and you lop off your legs. You haven't sacrificed it. If you lopped off your legs, to like please the devil or please Zeus or something. I don't know. That would be a sacrifice. Or you lopped off your leg because you thought it would give you some kind of like advantage for like something. That'd be sacrifice. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to me. How could you have a sacrifice without any meaningful discourse, or any contextual meaning? So, impotence of the sage to attain sovereignty in the basis of discourse. Thus, the sovereignty of sacrifice is not absolute either. It is not absolute to the extent that the institution maintains within the world of efficacious activity a form whose meaning is, on the contrary, sovereign. A slippage cannot fail to occur to the benefit of servitude. If the attitude of the sage, Hegel, is not for its part sovereign, at least things function in the opposite direction. Hegel did not distance himself, and he was unable to find authentic sovereignty. He came as near to it as he could. What separated him from it would even be imperceptible were we not able to glimpse a richer image through these alterations of meaning, which touch on sacrifice and which have reduced it from an end to a simple means. The key to a lesser rigorousness on the part of the sage is the fact not that discourse engages the sovereignty within a frame that cannot suit him and which atrophies it, but precisely the opposite. Sovereignty in Hegel's attitude proceeds from a movement which discourse reveals and which, in the sage's spirit, is never separated from its revelation. It can never, therefore, be fully sovereign. The sage, in fact, cannot fail to subordinate to the goal of a wisdom which supposes the completion of discourse. Wisdom alone will be full autonomy, the sovereignty of being. At least, it would be, if we could find sovereignty by searching for it. And in fact, if I search for it, I am undertaking a project of being sovereignly. But the project of being sovereignly presupposes a servile being. What nonetheless assures the sovereignty of the moment described is the absolute dismemberment of which Hegel speaks, the rupture for a time of discourse. But that rupture itself is not sovereign. In a sense, it is an accident in the ascent. Although the two sovereignties, the naive and the sage ones, are both sovereignties of death, beyond the difference between a decline at birth, given the gradual alteration and imperfect manifestation, they differ on yet another precise point. On Hegel's part, it is precisely a question of an accident. It is not a stroke of fate, a piece of bad luck, which would be forever deprived of senses. Dismemberment is, on the contrary, full of meaning. Spirit only attains its truth, writes Hegel. But it is, my emphasis, by finding itself in absolute dismemberment. But this meaning is unfortunate. It is what limited and impoverished the revelation which the sage drew from lingering in the regions where death reigns. He welcomed sovereignty as a weight which he let go. Okay, I think the critique here is just off. And mainly because, this is like a critique which Hegel anticipates. For example, he says in the beginning of the logic, he's like, I'm claiming here to be absolutely without presupposition. My logic is perfectly self-contained, doesn't, logically require anything else. And then somebody comes by and says, but what about language? Aren't you presupposing that? And he's like, well, yeah, but that's just an existential presupposition. It's not a logical presupposition. It doesn't determine the domain of logic. Of course it has to exist in language, but so what? And then it goes like, well, what about history? You're presupposing existential history. if it wasn't for the fact that we lived on Earth, then there had been microbes and evolution, and there are monkeys and the butterflies and the apes, and I don't know what else. And you have the history of human beings, and then Aristotle, and everybody else in between, and Kant, and then you wouldn't have you, and therefore you're presupposing that. And Hegel says, well, yes, it's an existential presupposition, but it's not a logical presupposition. It doesn't determine the domain of logic. So while those things are existentially presupposed, that's of no consequence to philosophy. So if the sovereignty is the sovereignty on its own ground. So if you're in a domain of logic, the sovereignty you're seeking is a logical sovereignty, as opposed to a existential sovereignty. So it ends up working. Of course, it ends up having an incomplete sovereignty as just mere logic. You end up having to develop the whole system that redevelops the entirety of nature, back to living beings, back to history, back to human beings, back to the philosopher at the end of history, who finally thinks the logic. And that's when you get the full closure, and that's when you get the real sovereignty, that is just self-standing. So for parts of the system, his critique works, but for the entire system as a whole, at least according to Hegel's own conception, he is practically missing the point. Do I intend to minimize Hegel's attitude? But the contrary is true. I want to show the incomparable scope of his approach. To that end, I cannot veil the very minimal and even inevitable part of failure. To my mind, it is rather the exceptional certainty of that approach which is brought out in my associations. If he failed, one cannot say it was the result of an error. The meaning of the failure itself differs from that of the failure which caused it. The error alone is perhaps fortuitous. In general, it is an authentic movement, weighty with sense, that one must speak of the failure of Hegel. Indeed, man is always in pursuit of an authentic sovereignty. That sovereignty apparently was, in a certain sense, originally his, but doubtless that could not have been in a conscious manner, and so in a sense it was not his, it escaped him. We shall see that in a number of ways he continued to pursue that what forever eluded him. The essential thing is that one cannot attain it consciously and seek it, because seeking distances it. And yet I can believe that nothing is given us that is not given in that equivocal manner. And that's the end of that.
So, I guess I should say, did you get what Bataille is trying to do? To put it bluntly.
Okay, so he went to the exposition of death. He goes about, the different modes of death which appear in Hegel, logical death, the movement of death, negativity.
Yeah.
Then he goes into, what was it? Starts going to the angle of the sacrifice, which becomes, this kind of the sort of like the natural consciousness form as opposed to like Hegel's absolute knowing form.
Mm-hmm.
And the natural consciousness is just it is what it is. It's not conscious of itself. It just does what it does. The absolute consciousness is conscious of itself. It knows what it does and it does it consciously. And Bataille is kind of at least the main point I'm getting here at the end is that he was trying to go through at least the major last point was he made it kind of obvious. He says I don't think there seems to be a necessary superiority between one and the other. They seem to have their own little form of absoluteness in a way, and their own failure of absoluteness in a way. And then the stuff in between about the pleasure, I don't know how it's connected.
Well, it's the whole pleasure with the whole encounter with death through sacrifice. And that's related to pleasure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that one just kind of struck me a bit off, so it just kind of comes out of left field and then, just kind of left hanging. But that's kind of what happens when, you're writing
Yeah.
this way.
I mean, he's pretty esoteric. Like he is pretty difficult to understand. You have to have that whole context there. So
Yeah, so I mean, I get it. I don't think it's bad. It's bad. I get the conceptual connections, the analogical form of the argument. You know, it's interesting. I don't quite buy it. I don't quite buy his thing on pleasure. I don't think all pleasure is reducible to that. I also just don't. I don't have a. I really don't get a sense of what his meaning of sacrifice is, because the idea of the sacrifice without an end seems just incomprehensible.
mm-hmm.
I mean, like, there is a mystical aspect in which, you know, there's something kind of like that, in which, you know, there are certain things in which, you know, since, you know, he analogizes sacrifice to rituals. I mean, there are rituals which you do which are not supposed to be for any end in themselves. You just do them um, for, you know, the off chance that, you know, they kind of get you out of the way of the situation. You know, they become this mindless repetition. You do them for the sake of just repetition. You know, you don't really do it for like any efficacious end whatsoever. You know, suddenly you just do it. You know, it's just contemplative prayer, or it's, you know, you're just trying the prayer wheel, or, you know, running your prayer beads, or, you know, counting your breaths, whatever. It's just a ritual you do, and you do it, and you do it, and you do it, and one day, you know, bam, enlightenment. You know, you have the.
Yeah.
But even that, you know, it's not a sacrifice without end. So I don't quite get what he meant by that. I mean, it's like the logical form I get, but I don't get like how that's supposed to be meaningful, because I can't conceive of a sacrifice without a sacrifice towards something.
Well, like the way that I understand Bataille is that he is, and pardon me because you know it's kind of vague here, but he is trying to sorry, I just lost my thought there. But if we approach things in the sense where, okay, life is inherently meaningless, like we understand in modernity, how do we bring meaning back into life? Or how do we, you know, rediscover these kinds of meanings, these kinds of, you know, and through, and what, yeah, I'm sorry here, like I'm tired and I can't think coherently right now, but it's just that general idea of like, of you know, we engage in sacrifice and orgies and very off the wall kinds of behaviors. Why? Because it brings that meaning back in. But
Do we?
yeah, maybe.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm not explaining it very well. I admit that, but yeah, it's nice.
I just like how you said we engage in orgies.
Oh,
We
yeah.
do?
We do.
We do?
We do.
Did I
Okay.
hallucinate? No.
But
Yeah, I
yeah,
get what you mean.
yeah, it's
Okay, so that brings it in more context, makes it more intelligible, makes more
yeah.
sense.
Well, Bataille's very much a Nietzschean, so there's that aspect of it too. So
Yeah, I definitely wish he had expanded on the pleasure link and just like made that link more solid, because that just seemed that frankly that was the more interesting thing. I feel the link to sacrifice was a bit too immediate. He didn't really go into enough detail to like just flesh it out in notion that really links to what we normally understand as sacrifice. You know, he just kind of says it and he just rolls with it, and I don't know. That just seems too gung ho for me. But not bad. I mean, he's not a bad writer. I have to say, I enjoy Kojev far more. Kojev has a far more flowing style, but he doesn't write dirty
Yeah.
things. But
Oh, he does. He talks about the vulgar scientists.
but yeah, all right. Good reading. Good reading. we'll leave it there. That was 2 hours and almost 30 minutes. So for those of you who listen, enjoy. Or rather, I hope you enjoyed if you listened.
I don't want to provide the injunction to enjoy.
Enjoy, goddammit.
Just,
Enjoy and like hit that like and
Don't-
subscribe and do all those stupid things. Actually, don't.
Yeah, don't engage in just the empty pleasure of the pursuit of pleasure.
I think Bataille would say, please pursue
Yeah, I know,
all those
but
dirty
I
pleasures.
disagree. I know, and I don't know. I'm like the person he was describing, saying that they're opposed to that.
I'm just a massive prude. I don't even know why. Like I'm a radical
We
like with
know why.
politics and all these other things, but when it comes to those
Yeah.
things, I am a massive prude.
Yeah, me too, I guess. Because I want genuine experiences. I don't want just carnal pleasure.
Well, be that as it may, we'll leave it here. Goodbye,
Yeah.
people.
All right.
All right.
Good
Farewell.
night.